Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where entire villages could vanish without warning, leaving behind silent houses, abandoned cooking pots, empty wells, and fields that no one would ever harvest again. Imagine waking one ordinary morning in medieval Europe, ancient Asia, or the high mountains of the Andes, only to discover that every neighboring home stood open, every fire had gone cold, and every familiar voice had disappeared into an unsettling silence. There were no newspapers to explain the mystery, no emergency broadcasts, and certainly no satellites watching from above. People could simply be there one season and gone the next. Tonight, we will slowly explore the forgotten stories behind these disappearances, not through legends of ghosts or impossible myths, but through the very real hardships of disease, climate, war, famine, natural disasters, and the countless fragile circumstances that shaped everyday human life for thousands of years. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet historical journeys. Now, dim the lights, relax, and let us wander into one of history's most haunting mysteries. Modern people often imagine villages as permanent places. We picture stone churches that survive for centuries, roads that remain on maps forever, and communities passed from one generation to another without interruption. Reality was far less stable. Throughout history, villages were surprisingly temporary. Thousands appeared, flourished for a few decades or centuries, and then quietly disappeared. Some were swallowed by forests. Others sank beneath lakes or drifting sand. A few were erased by volcanoes, while many simply faded after years of slow hardship that left no dramatic final chapter. For the people living inside these settlements, permanence was never guaranteed. Every season carried uncertainty. A successful harvest might support another year of life, while one failed crop could begin a chain of events from which the village would never recover. Unlike modern cities supplied by highways, electricity, and global trade, small historical communities depended almost entirely upon their immediate surroundings. The nearby river, the local woodland, grazing fields, and seasonal weather determined whether families could survive. One unusually cold winter might kill livestock. Several weeks without rain could ruin grain. An unexpected flood might carry away bridges and fertile soil alike. The difference between survival and abandonment could sometimes be measured in only a few months. Many vanished villages never experienced a single dramatic catastrophe. Instead, they disappeared through countless small difficulties, accumulating year after year. Historians sometimes compare this process to slowly removing individual threads from a woven cloth. At first, nothing appears unusual. Eventually, however, the entire fabric begins to fall apart. Consider an ordinary farming settlement somewhere in northern Europe around the 12th century. Perhaps only 60 or 70 people lived there. Nearly everyone knew everyone else. Several extended families worked neighboring strips of land. Chickens wandered freely between cottages. Smoke drifted from thatched roofs during the cold mornings. Children carried water from the stream, while older villagers repaired fences damaged during winter storms. Life followed rhythms dictated by nature rather than clocks. Spring meant planting. Summer demanded endless labor. Autumn brought anxious harvests. Winter tested every storehouse. There was little room for error. If enough grain could not be stored before snowfall, hunger might arrive long before spring returned. These communities often appeared remarkably peaceful from a distance. Yet beneath everyday routines existed constant vulnerability. A village usually possessed limited medical knowledge. There were no hospitals nearby. Most illnesses were treated with herbs, experience, prayers, or simple hope. An injury that today might require a brief visit to a clinic could become fatal after infection spread unchecked. Even childbirth remained extraordinarily dangerous. A single difficult winter might claim several elderly residents. A harsh epidemic could remove dozens more. Every individual represented valuable labor. Losing only a handful of adults could seriously weaken the entire settlement's ability to plant crops, repair buildings, or protect livestock. This delicate balance explains why historical villages sometimes vanished so quickly once hardship began. One family departed first, another followed during the next season, a third decided relatives elsewhere offered better prospects. Empty houses gradually multiplied. Fields remained untilled. Roofs collapsed from neglect. Within only a generation, travelers passing through might find nothing except abandoned foundations slowly disappearing beneath grass. Centuries later, archaeologists would excavate these forgotten places, discovering fragments of pottery, broken knives, iron nails, animal bones, children's toys, and burned cooking vessels. Every object silently testified that ordinary people had once laughed, argued, celebrated marriages, buried loved ones, and dreamed about futures that never unfolded as expected. Some disappearances occurred so gradually that no resident ever realized they were witnessing the village's final years. Imagine an elderly farmer watching young neighbors leave one after another. His eldest son joins merchants in a growing town. His daughter marries into another valley. The local blacksmith retires without an apprentice. The mill beside the stream stops operating because too few families remain. Nothing extraordinary happens on any particular day. Yet 20 years later, the settlement exists only in memory. Environmental change proved especially unforgiving. Today, climate scientists possess satellites, computer models, and centuries of recorded observations. Historical communities possessed only experience passed through generations. They recognized familiar weather patterns, but rarely understood why those patterns suddenly changed. One famous period, known as the medieval warm period, brought relatively favorable conditions across parts of Europe. Crops expanded into higher elevations. Populations increased. New villages appeared in regions previously considered marginal for farming. Then conditions slowly shifted. Temperatures cooled. Growing seasons shortened. Heavy rains damaged harvests in some areas, while drought affected others. Settlements established during prosperous decades suddenly found themselves struggling to produce enough food. No dramatic announcement informed villagers that climate itself had become less reliable. Instead, each harvest became slightly more uncertain. One poor season followed another. Livestock weakened. Food reserves disappeared earlier every winter. People adapted where possible. Sometimes adaptation succeeded. Sometimes entire communities quietly dissolved. Forests also played an unexpected role in the disappearance of villages. Medieval woodlands supplied nearly everything essential for survival. Timber constructed homes. Firewood provided warmth. Animals grazed beneath tree cover. Hunters obtained meat, while gatherers collected berries, mushrooms, medicinal plants, and useful fibers. When nearby forests became depleted, villagers faced increasingly difficult choices. Travel farther every year for firewood. Reduce heating during harsh winters. Purchase timber if markets existed, or relocate entirely. Even successful settlements could gradually exhaust surrounding natural resources without realizing the long-term consequences. Soil itself could betray generations of careful work. Continuous farming without modern fertilizers slowly reduced fertility. Ancient farmers understood crop rotation better than often assumed, yet practical limitations prevented perfect management. Population growth sometimes forced cultivation onto thinner soils or steeper hillsides where erosion steadily carried valuable nutrients away. The land looked familiar. The fields remained. Yet every harvest yielded slightly less grain. At first, the difference seemed manageable, then increasingly difficult, eventually impossible. Water could nurture villages for centuries before becoming their greatest threat. Rivers shifted course naturally over decades. Marshes expanded. Wells dried unexpectedly. Floodplains accumulated layers of sediment that buried farmland beneath coarse gravel unsuitable for cultivation. A settlement built beside an ideal stream in one century might discover 200 years later that the water no longer flowed where it once had. Moving an entire village required enormous effort, but remaining without dependable water proved even more dangerous. Not every disappearance left visible ruins. Many villages were constructed primarily from wood, earth, reeds, and thatch. Unlike massive stone castles, ordinary homes decayed surprisingly quickly after abandonment. Roofs collapsed within years. Rain softened mud walls. Plants invaded empty interiors. Trees rooted themselves inside forgotten doorways. after enough time, even local people forgot precisely where earlier generations had lived. Only subtle depressions beneath forest leaves hinted at vanished streets. Archaeologists often describe these places as ghost landscapes rather than ghost towns. Nothing supernatural lingers there, only quiet evidence of ordinary human existence reclaimed by nature. Travelers occasionally stumbled upon such abandoned places and invented stories to explain them. Without written records, imagination filled the gaps. Some believed evil spirits had driven residents away. Others whispered about curses, mysterious diseases, or punishments sent by heaven. These stories spread because real explanations were often invisible. Climate cannot easily be seen. Soil exhaustion leaves few dramatic signs. Economic decline rarely produces spectacular ruins. Reality often appeared less exciting than legend, yet it was infinitely more common. Long before written history preserved detailed accounts, countless unnamed communities had already come and gone across every inhabited continent. Their names disappeared first. Their traditions faded next. Finally, even memory itself vanished. Only the earth remembered. And sometimes, centuries later, careful excavation allowed those forgotten lives to speak once more through fragments buried beneath the soil. The first clues usually appeared by accident. A farmer's plow struck unusual stones. A construction crew uncovered ancient pottery. Heavy rain exposed forgotten foundations. Each discovery raised the same quiet question: who lived here? More intriguingly, why did they leave? Those questions would lead historians into one of the most fascinating investigations in human history, revealing that villages rarely disappeared for a single reason. Instead, each abandoned settlement became a puzzle assembled from weather, disease, economics, politics, geography, and simple human decisions made under extraordinary pressure. And among all those forces, none inspired more fear or spread more silently than the invisible arrival of epidemic disease, a threat capable of transforming a thriving community into an empty landscape within remarkably little time. The first signs rarely appeared dramatic enough to alarm an entire village. More often, they resembled the ordinary illnesses people had witnessed countless times before. Someone complained of an aching back after working in the fields. Another developed a mild fever that everyone assumed would disappear after several days of rest. A child remained unusually quiet during supper. An elderly neighbor skipped the weekly gathering because walking had become unexpectedly difficult. None of these events seemed remarkable on their own. Villagers had learned through experience that sickness came and went with the seasons. They expected some people to recover quickly, while others required more time. What they could not know was whether these scattered cases belonged to familiar ailments or the beginning of something entirely different. Life in historical villages naturally encouraged close contact. Families often shared single-room cottages where several generations slept beneath the same roof. Livestock occupied attached shelters during colder months, helping preserve warmth, but also bringing humans and animals into constant proximity. Wells served every household. Bread came from communal ovens. Markets gathered neighboring settlements together whenever weather permitted. Religious ceremonies placed dozens of people shoulder to shoulder inside modest churches or temples. Weddings, harvest festivals, and funerals strengthened social bonds, while unintentionally providing opportunities for contagious illnesses to spread from one family to another. Nobody understood bacteria. Nobody had seen viruses. The invisible world remained completely unknown. Many communities believed sickness resulted from corrupted air, divine displeasure, unfavorable planetary alignments, or mysterious natural forces beyond human comprehension. These explanations were not foolish for their time. They represented sincere attempts to understand events using the knowledge available. Without microscopes or laboratory science, people interpreted disease through observation, tradition, and faith. Imagine an ordinary spring morning in a village surrounded by wheat fields. The sun rises gently above distant hills. Farmers prepare their tools. Women begin baking bread, while children chase chickens across muddy paths. Nothing appears unusual. Yet one traveler arrives before noon, leading a tired mule loaded with cloth, salt, or iron tools. He stays only a single night before continuing toward another market. He seems healthy enough. Perhaps he coughs occasionally, blamming the dust collected along the road. Nobody worries. Hospitality requires offering shelter, food, and water. Days later, several villagers begin coughing as well. Another develops a persistent fever. Within a week, more households report similar symptoms. Still, nobody imagines the entire settlement stands at the beginning of a disaster. Travel connected medieval and ancient communities far more than modern imagination sometimes assumes. Merchants crossed mountains. Pilgrims visited sacred shrines. Soldiers marched between kingdoms. Craftsmen searched for work. Messengers carried official orders over astonishing distances. Although villages often appeared isolated, they remained linked through invisible networks of roads, rivers, and trade routes stretching across continents. Those same connections carried diseases. Sometimes the illness moved faster than news itself. One village might hear rumors of sickness elsewhere, only after infection had already arrived. The psychological burden proved almost as devastating as the disease itself. Families watched loved ones weaken without understanding why certain individuals survived while others deteriorated rapidly. Treatments varied widely. Herbal remedies were carefully prepared from local plants. Compresses cooled burning foreheads. Religious leaders offered prayers and blessings. Some communities organized processions seeking divine mercy. Others isolated the sick as best they could. Although crowded homes made separation nearly impossible, many recovered, many did not. The uncertainty frightened everyone. Historical records occasionally describe villages where church bells rang so frequently for funerals that their sound became part of everyday life. At first, each death received traditional ceremonies attended by relatives and neighbors. As mortality increased, gatherings grew smaller because so many mourners themselves had become ill. Eventually, exhaustion overtook grief. People simply lacked the strength to maintain customary rituals. Yet epidemic disease rarely affected every settlement equally. One village suffered enormous losses. Another, only a few miles away, experienced relatively minor illness. This uneven pattern puzzled generations of observers. Today, historians recognize many possible reasons. Differences in water quality, nutrition, housing conditions, previous exposure to similar diseases, population density, and simple chance all influenced outcomes. At the time, however, these variations seemed mysterious. Fortune itself appeared unpredictable. One valley prospered, the next mourned. Survivors naturally searched for explanations. Some blamed outsiders. Others questioned spiritual failings. Still others accepted events with quiet resignation because no convincing answer existed. Long before the famous pandemics recorded in textbooks, smaller outbreaks repeatedly transformed local landscapes. These epidemics seldom received dramatic names because chroniclers rarely documented every rural tragedy. Cities attracted writers, officials, and religious scholars whose records survived. Villages often left almost nothing behind except archaeological evidence. That silence creates a misleading impression. History remembers capitals. The countryside endured countless forgotten catastrophes. Excavations sometimes reveal cemeteries expanding unusually quickly over only a few years. Burials become more frequent. Graves overlap older ones. Careful arrangements give way to practical necessity. Archaeologists interpret these subtle changes cautiously, but together they often suggest periods when mortality suddenly increased beyond ordinary expectations. Every skeleton represents an individual life, someone's parent, someone's child, someone who once expected another ordinary harvest. For those still living, practical problems accumulated almost immediately. Fields required planting regardless of grief. Animals still demanded feeding. Roofs leaked after heavy rain, whether households mourned or celebrated. Disease removed workers precisely when labor became most essential. Even families spared from illness found themselves helping neighbors, stretching already limited resources. Imagine a village where 30 adults normally harvested grain together. Now only 18 remain healthy enough to work. The crop cannot wait. Every delayed day increases losses. Rain threatens ripened wheat. Exhausted, survivors struggle from dawn until darkness. Despite their efforts, much of the harvest spoils before reaching storage. The consequences extend far beyond the epidemic itself. Food shortages follow. Livestock receive less fodder. Winter becomes more dangerous. What began as disease slowly transforms into economic collapse. Children experienced these crises differently from adults. They rarely understood the larger pattern unfolding around them. Instead, they noticed familiar routines disappearing. Friends stopped coming outside to play. Parents whispered late into the night. Grandparents no longer occupied their usual places near the hearth. The cheerful sounds of village life gradually faded, replaced by long stretches of uneasy quiet. Such memories often remained for a lifetime. Those who survived carried invisible emotional burdens into adulthood. Entire generations remembered seasons defined not by festivals or harvests, but by absence. Absence at family meals, absence in church pews, absence among neighbors whose cottages slowly stood empty. When enough families disappeared, villages entered an especially fragile stage. Empty houses deteriorated quickly. Unused gardens became overgrown. Fences collapsed because nobody repaired them. Wells required constant maintenance, and neglected infrastructure gradually failed. Remaining residents now faced an impossible calculation. Should they stay, or should they leave, while opportunity still existed elsewhere? Relocation was never simple. Homes represented years of labor. Fields connected families to ancestors buried nearby. Leaving meant abandoning familiar landscapes that shaped every memory, yet remaining sometimes promised only continued hardship. Many households delayed their decision until another poor harvest or another outbreak finally convinced them to depart. The process rarely resembled a panicked escape. Instead, departures occurred one wagon at a time. One family joined relatives in another valley. Another sought employment near a growing town. A widow moved to live with married children. Months passed, then years. Eventually, only a handful of elderly residents remained. Visitors arriving decades later found weathered buildings leaning quietly beneath climbing vines. Wind moved through broken shutters, once opened every morning by people whose names no longer survived in written records. Nature reclaimed abandoned settlements with remarkable patience. Grass filled narrow paths where countless footsteps had once passed daily. Wildflowers appeared in neglected gardens. Birds nested inside collapsed rafters. Foxes explored empty storage sheds. Young trees rooted beside forgotten doorways, splitting foundations stone by stone as seasons turned into generations. From a distance, the village slowly vanished, not because it had been erased overnight, but because life elsewhere continued, while this place quietly stood still. Centuries afterward, travelers occasionally crossed such landscapes without realizing they were walking directly above former streets. Beneath only a thin layer of soil rested broken pottery, rusted tools, spindle whorls, cooking hearths, children's marbles, and scattered animal bones, all preserved because ordinary existence had ended before these objects completed their natural cycle of use and replacement. Disease alone, however, rarely tells the entire story. Even communities that survived epidemics often faced another relentless enemy waiting beyond the horizon, one that arrived not through travelers or marketplaces, but through the sky itself. The weather was beginning to change. For generations, people trusted the rhythm of the seasons because those rhythms had shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Grandparents taught children when the first frost usually arrived, which winds brought spring rain, and how birds, insects, and flowering trees often signaled the right moment to sow grain. This knowledge accumulated slowly through observation rather than written science. It served villages remarkably well for long periods because weather patterns often remained relatively stable within a human lifetime. Then sometimes they changed, not suddenly enough for everyone to notice, but steadily enough that life became increasingly difficult. One spring arrived later than expected. Another summer proved cooler. Autumn rains lingered longer than anyone remembered. Each individual year seemed unusual, but not extraordinary. Only after decades did people realize the old patterns no longer matched reality. Modern historians and climate scientists now understand that Earth's climate has never remained perfectly constant. Long before factories or automobiles existed, natural shifts in temperature, volcanic eruptions, changing ocean currents, and variations in solar activity influenced growing conditions across entire regions. Villagers could not see these immense forces unfolding. They experienced only their local consequences. A farmer looked toward dark clouds and wondered whether rain would arrive. He never imagined distant volcanic ash or changes in atmospheric circulation might influence the harvest. To him, the sky simply behaved differently than it once had. Consider a modest settlement built along the edge of fertile farmland during an unusually warm period. When the first families arrived decades earlier, the land produced generous harvests. Wheat ripened reliably. Sheep grazed on nearby hillsides. Streams flowed throughout the summer. Children grew up believing prosperity was normal because that was all they had ever known. Their grandchildren inherited a different landscape. The growing season shortened by only a few weeks. At first, the difference seemed minor. Seeds still sprouted. Fields still turned green. Yet crops matured more slowly. Early frosts occasionally struck before harvest finished. Every year became a careful race against time. No single season destroyed the village. Instead, countless small disappointments accumulated until confidence itself began to disappear. People noticed subtle details long before outsiders would have recognized a problem. Fruit trees blossomed later. Hay remained damp because sunshine arrived less frequently. Streams that once flowed steadily became unpredictable. Some years they overflowed after relentless rain. Other years they shrank into narrow channels, barely capable of supplying drinking water. Every change forced new decisions. Should families plant earlier? Would different grains survive better? Could livestock replace crops if fields became unreliable? Experimenting carried enormous risks. A failed decision meant hunger. Unlike modern farmers, historical villagers could not quickly purchase additional seed from distant suppliers or compensate for losses through insurance. Every mistake reduced next year's possibilities. Grain reserved for planting could not also feed hungry children. Livestock slaughtered during winter could not produce offspring in spring. The margin between security and disaster remained painfully narrow. Heavy rainfall created problems beyond flooded fields. Dirt roads transformed into deep mud that trapped wagons for days. Bridges washed away, isolating settlements from neighboring markets. Mill wheels stopped turning when rivers became too violent to use safely. Stored grain sometimes spoiled inside damp barns before families realized moisture had seeped through damaged roofs. The loss appeared gradual. A few sacks here, several barrels there. Nothing seemed catastrophic until winter inventories revealed uncomfortable shortages. Entire communities learned to count every loaf of bread with increasing care. On the opposite extreme, drought carried its own quiet cruelty. Wells dropped lower each week. Streams became shallow enough for children to cross without getting their knees wet. Cattle wandered farther searching for grass. Dust settled over fields where green shoots should have been growing. The landscape grew strangely silent. Fewer birds visited. Frogs disappeared from drying ponds. Even insects seemed less abundant. Experienced farmers recognized these warnings immediately. Nature itself appeared exhausted. When rain finally arrived after months of waiting, it sometimes came too late. Hardened soil absorbed little water. Instead, sudden downpours rushed across the surface, carrying valuable topsoil into rivers below. Years of careful cultivation disappeared within a single afternoon, leaving behind exposed stones and shallow earth, unable to support healthy crops. Villagers understood erosion without using the modern word. They simply watched their best land slowly vanish. Forests reflected these changing conditions as well. Trees weakened after repeated droughts or severe winters. Storms toppled mature oaks that had stood for centuries. Woodcutters walked farther each year to gather suitable timber because nearby stands recovered more slowly than before. The woodland still existed, yet it no longer provided everything the village required. Firewood became precious. building materials grew scarce. Simple repairs were postponed because suitable beams could not easily be replaced. Small delays accumulated into larger problems. A leaking roof, ignored one autumn, became serious by the next spring. A damaged fence, left unrepaired, allowed livestock to wander. Broken drainage channels flooded gardens after every storm. Nothing collapsed immediately. The village simply became harder to maintain. Many settlements depended upon a single reliable spring emerging from hillsides above their homes. These springs often flowed consistently for generations, encouraging people to believe they would last forever. But groundwater responds to changing rainfall patterns over long periods. A spring that once filled buckets effortlessly might gradually weaken until only a trickle remained during summer months. Water disputes followed. Families woke before sunrise hopping to collect enough for cooking before supplies diminished. Neighbors who had shared resources peacefully for decades now found themselves competing for necessities. Historical records occasionally mention disagreements over wells, irrigation channels, and grazing rights becoming increasingly bitter during difficult years. Scarcity rarely improved relationships. It tested them. Another challenge emerged from the sea. Along many coastlines, fishing villages depended on predictable catches that supported entire communities. Fish populations naturally shift with changing water temperatures and ocean conditions. Medieval fishermen lacked scientific explanations, yet they recognized familiar species becoming less common. Boats returned carrying fewer fish. Nets required longer hours for smaller rewards. Salted stores, intended for winter, remained half empty. Families compensated however they could. Some gathered shellfish, others trapped birds along the shore. Many accepted poorer diets because no better option existed. A village rarely abandoned itself after one disappointing fishing season. 5 or 10 difficult years told a different story. Mountain settlements faced unique uncertainties. Snow accumulated differently from one generation to the next. Avalanches threatened paths connecting isolated communities to surrounding valleys. Glaciers advanced during colder periods, altering rivers and burying grazing land beneath expanding ice. Travel became more dangerous. Trade slowed. Medical help, limited though it already was, became even harder to reach. Isolation that once offered security gradually transformed into vulnerability. Parents began wondering whether children would enjoy safer futures elsewhere. Many answered that question by leaving. Climate also influenced disease in subtle ways. Wet conditions encouraged mold that spoiled stored grain. Standing water increased insects in some regions. Malnourished people, weakened by repeated crop failures, struggled to recover from illnesses that healthier bodies might have survived. One hardship strengthened another. Poor harvests reduced nutrition. Malnutrition reduced resistance. Disease claimed more lives. Fewer workers meant smaller harvests. The cycle repeated. Breaking free became increasingly difficult. Some villages attempted remarkable adaptations rather than immediate abandonment. Farmers experimented with hardier grains, such as rye, instead of wheat, because rye tolerated colder conditions more effectively. Hillsides were terraced to reduce erosion. Drainage ditches redirected excess water from flooded fields. Communities organized shared labor, so every household benefited from limited manpower. These efforts often succeeded for a while. Human resilience deserves recognition alongside human suffering. History is filled not only with disasters, but with determined attempts to overcome them. Yet adaptation had limits. No amount of cooperation could create fertile soil where none remained. No careful planning could prevent every frost. No village, however resourceful, controlled the weather itself. Eventually, practical choices replaced hopeful ones. Young adults married into more prosperous settlements. Craftsmen relocated where customers remained plentiful. Local leaders struggled to organize communal work because too few people stayed behind. The school closed first. The mill operated only occasionally. Religious services became infrequent as congregations dwindled. Silence expanded gradually through familiar streets. An abandoned cottage rarely stayed empty for long before weather began dismantling it. Thatched roofs sagged after the first neglected winter. Rain entered through small openings. Wooden beams absorbed moisture and weakened. Within a few seasons, walls leaned at uncertain angles. Ivy climbed over windows once polished every morning. Moss spread across stone foundations. Nature showed no hostility, only patience. Given enough time, it reclaimed everything. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover pollen preserved beneath ancient lake sediments, tree rings hidden inside old timbers, and layers of mud deposited by forgotten floods. These quiet pieces of evidence revealed that climate had changed alongside human history, influencing decisions made by ordinary families whose names disappeared long ago. But weather and disease were not the only forces capable of emptying an entire settlement. Sometimes the danger came from other people, and unlike storms or harsh winters, human conflict often arrived with intention, leaving villages to confront an uncertainty even more frightening than nature itself. For most villagers throughout history, war did not begin with armies clashing outside their homes. It began with rumors, a merchant arriving later than expected, a traveler speaking in unusually quiet tones, a horseman refusing to stop for the night because he wished to reach the next town before sunset. Someone had seen soldiers crossing a distant river. Someone else claimed an important fortress had fallen. Another insisted the fighting remained hundreds of miles away. No one knew which story was true, yet every conversation carried the same uneasy question. Would the war remain somewhere else, or would it eventually reach them? Most historical villages possessed little ability to defend themselves. Their homes were built for farming, not for battle. Wooden fences kept livestock from wandering into fields, but they offered almost no protection against organized soldiers. A handful of hunting bows, wood-cutting axes, and simple spears could discourage thieves. Yet they were nearly useless against experienced armies equipped with armor and discipline. Villagers understood this reality. Their greatest hope was often to remain unnoticed. Sometimes that strategy succeeded. Many conflicts passed without affecting isolated communities. Other times, however, geography proved impossible to ignore. A settlement located beside an important road, river crossing, mountain pass, or fertile valley inevitably attracted attention. Armies required food, fresh water, horses, firewood, and places to rest. Even a peaceful farming village possessed exactly the supplies thousands of marching soldiers desperately needed. The soldiers themselves were not always cruel men. Many had families waiting far away. Many were hungry. Many had gone weeks without reliable supplies. An army on the move rarely carried everything necessary for long campaigns. Instead, it lived from the surrounding countryside. That countryside consisted of villages. Imagine an ordinary autumn afternoon. Farmers gather the final bundles of wheat before approaching rain. Smoke rises from ovens preparing evening meals. Children help collect apples from nearby orchards. The familiar rhythm of work continues without interruption. Then a distant sound appears. Not thunder, not wind, hoofbeats. At first, only a few, then hundreds. The ground itself begins to vibrate. People stop working. They look toward the road. Dust rises above the horizon. Within minutes, uncertainty replaces routine. Nobody knows whether the approaching force belongs to friendly troops, enemies, mercenaries, or desperate refugees. Every possibility carries danger. Some families hide valuables beneath floorboards. Others drive livestock into nearby forests. Parents gather children indoors. Village elders discuss impossible choices with remarkable speed. Should everyone remain? Should they flee immediately? Should they greet the soldiers peacefully? No decision guarantees safety. Historical records frequently emphasize that villages suffered not only because armies fought there, but because armies needed constant supplies. Grain stored for winter disappeared into military wagons. Chickens, pigs, cattle, and sheep became food for thousands of hungry men. Wells emptied rapidly beneath overwhelming demand. Firewood collected through months of labor vanished within a single evening. The soldiers marched onward. The villagers remained behind. Winter approached. Their carefully prepared stores had disappeared. Sometimes destruction occurred without deliberate violence. A single cooking fire escaped its stone hearth. Dry thatched roofs ignited almost instantly. Strong winds carried sparks from one building to another. Within minutes, flames raced through tightly packed cottages. Historical villages burned with frightening speed. Wooden walls, straw roofs, stored hay, firewood stacked beside homes. Everything encouraged the flames. People formed desperate lines, carrying buckets from nearby wells or rivers. Often they failed. Even if every resident survived, losing houses before winter created another catastrophe. Building materials required time. Skilled carpenters were few. Cold weather waited for no one. Many communities never fully recovered. Some conflicts lasted only months. Others continued for generations. Children born during wartime sometimes reached adulthood before genuine peace returned. Villages repeatedly rebuilt only to experience another raid several years later. Every reconstruction demanded enormous effort. Every destruction discouraged those considering whether to remain. Eventually, families concluded that rebuilding no longer made sense. They quietly left instead. The emotional burden proved just as heavy as the physical damage. Imagine watching the orchard planted by your grandfather cut down for military firewood. Picture fields abandoned because fighting made planting too dangerous. Think of familiar neighbors disappearing after seeking safety elsewhere, never to return. A village consists of more than buildings. It consists of relationships. When those relationships scatter, rebuilding becomes far more difficult than replacing walls. Refugees formed another often overlooked consequence of war. Entire populations moved across regions searching for security. Some villages welcomed newcomers, grateful for additional workers capable of restoring abandoned fields. Others struggled because scarce food now supported even more mouths. The balance remained delicate. A settlement already weakened by poor harvests could collapse beneath the pressure of caring for displaced families. Yet refusing help conflicted with deeply held traditions of hospitality. Every decision carried painful consequences. Occasionally, people abandoned villages before soldiers even arrived. News traveled surprisingly quickly through merchants, monks, river boatmen, and wandering craftsmen. Communities hearing of advancing armies sometimes packed essential belongings and disappeared into forests, marshes, or mountain valleys. They intended to return after the danger passed. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they found only ashes. Sometimes another army occupied the region before rebuilding became possible. The temporary evacuation quietly became permanent abandonment. Archaeologists occasionally uncover fascinating evidence of these hurried departures. Coins hidden beneath hearthstones remained untouched because owners never returned. Iron tools lay exactly where craftsmen left them. Cooking pots still contained traces of meals, interrupted unexpectedly. Personal belongings, normally considered valuable, remained inside collapsed homes. These discoveries tell remarkably human stories. People expected to come back. History chose otherwise. Castles often dominate popular imagination, yet they could unintentionally contribute to village disappearances. Large fortifications attracted sieges lasting months. Nearby settlements found themselves trapped between opposing forces. Crops could not be harvested safely. Livestock wandered unattended. Wells became contested resources, even if armies avoided directly attacking villages. Ordinary life became impossible. Some residents escaped during the fighting. Others perished from hunger. When peace finally returned, too few survivors remained to restore what had been lost. Not every threat came from professional armies. During periods when governments weakened, organized bands of raiders traveled through rural regions seeking food, livestock, and valuables. Small villages lacked permanent guards capable of resisting repeated attacks. After suffering several raids, families often reached the same conclusion. Living elsewhere offered better chances for survival. Trade also collapsed during prolonged conflicts. Merchants avoided dangerous roads. Blacksmiths received fewer customers. Mills processed less grain because harvests declined. Craftsmen relocated towards safer markets where business continued. Economic life slowly drained away. Without commerce, villages became increasingly isolated. Young people noticed first. Opportunities disappeared. Marriage prospects narrowed. Ambitious families sought futures beyond familiar fields. The oldest generation often remained behind, not because life remained easy, because leaving everything they had ever known seemed even harder. Nature quietly assisted the process. Empty gardens filled with weeds. Livestock paths vanished beneath tall grass. Fruit trees continued producing apples no one gathered. Wind pushed open forgotten doors until broken hinges surrendered completely. Travelers passing years later might assume nobody had ever lived there. Only careful observation revealed straight lines where roads once crossed, a scattering of worked stones, fragments of painted pottery, perhaps an old well concealed beneath bushes, enough to suggest a community had once flourished. History remembers famous battles. It records kings, generals, and treaties. Far less frequently does it remember the nameless farming villages that disappeared because those larger events unfolded around them. Yet those villages fed kingdoms, raised children, maintained roads, produced wool, grain, timber, and countless ordinary necessities. Their disappearance reshaped entire landscapes without attracting chroniclers eager to describe dramatic victories. Sometimes war ended, sometimes peace returned, but the people did not. The village simply became another empty place, reclaimed by passing seasons. Still, despite disease, changing climate, and human conflict, history preserved another category of disappearance, even more startling. There were moments when an entire settlement did not decline over decades. It vanished within a single day. The earth itself had decided to move. For countless generations, people believed the ground beneath their feet represented the one certainty that could always be trusted. Rivers flooded, forests changed, winters arrived earlier or later than expected, and wars swept across kingdoms. But the earth itself seemed permanent. Villagers built homes with the quiet confidence that tomorrow the same hills would still overlook the same fields, and the same paths would still connect neighboring farms. Most days, that assumption proved correct. Occasionally, however, nature reminded humanity that even the land itself was never entirely still. Unlike famine or disease, geological disasters often arrived without giving ordinary people enough time to understand what was happening. There were no scientific instruments measuring underground pressure. No emergency warning systems transmitted messages across valleys. A strange sound beneath the earth might simply be dismissed as distant thunder. An unusual vibration could be blamed on heavily loaded wagons or a passing herd of animals. By the time the truth became obvious, there was often very little anyone could do. Earthquakes have accompanied human civilization since the first villages appeared thousands of years ago. Archaeological excavations across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas reveal repeated evidence of settlements suddenly interrupted by violent seismic activity. Walls collapsed in directions that clearly reflected powerful shaking rather than gradual decay. Roof beams fell exactly where they had broken. Storage jars remained shattered beneath layers of fallen stone, preserving a frozen moment of ordinary life interrupted without warning. Imagine an ordinary afternoon somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, nearly 2,000 years ago. The sun hangs high above the hills. Women grind grain outside their homes. Children chase one another between narrow streets. A blacksmith repeatedly strikes glowing iron with measured rhythm. The sound echoes comfortably through the village. Then another sound appears. It is difficult to describe. Not loud, not immediately frightening. More like a deep vibration rising from somewhere beneath the ground itself. Several people stop working. Animals react before humans do. Dogs begin barking. Horses pull nervously against their ropes. Sheep gather together without any obvious reason. Birds suddenly rise from nearby trees. The first tremor lasts only a few seconds. People exchange uncertain glances. Someone laughs nervously. Life begins to resume. Then the second shock arrives. This time, the ground moves with unmistakable force. Walls sway. Clay pots tumble from shelves. Dust pours from wooden ceilings. People struggle to remain standing because the earth itself no longer behaves as expected. There is no enemy to fight, no storm to shelter from. The very surface of the world has become unpredictable. Historical earthquakes frequently lasted less than a minute. For those experiencing them, however, time seemed strangely distorted. Seconds felt endless. Every movement appeared impossible to anticipate. People instinctively tried to protect children, elderly relatives, and anyone trapped beneath collapsing roofs. Many never reached them. Traditional village construction varied widely from one region to another. Some communities built with timber that flexed during shaking. Others relied heavily upon stone and mud brick because those materials were abundant and durable under normal conditions. Ironically, durability sometimes became a weakness. Heavy stone walls collapsed with tremendous force. Large roof tiles became deadly. Doorways jammed. Escape routes disappeared beneath rubble almost instantly. Even villages surviving the initial earthquake often faced additional dangers. Wells cracked or became contaminated by debris. Springs changed course unexpectedly. Landslides blocked roads connecting settlements with outside assistance. Aftershocks followed. Nobody knew when the next tremor would arrive. People feared entering damaged homes, yet sleeping outdoors exposed them to cold, rain, and hunger. Every decision carried uncertainty. Modern disaster response relies upon organized rescue teams, heavy machinery, medical helicopters, and coordinated communication. Historical villages possessed none of these advantages. Rescue depended entirely upon neighbors. Hands removed stones one by one. Wooden beams served as simple levers. Ropes pulled survivors from collapsed structures whenever possible. The work continued until exhaustion forced people to stop. Sometimes voices continued calling beneath the ruins. Sometimes the voices gradually fell silent. Earthquakes rarely affected only one settlement. Entire regions could suffer simultaneously, leaving neighboring villages equally overwhelmed. The people most likely to offer assistance had already become victims themselves. Recovery, therefore, progressed painfully slowly. Some communities rebuilt immediately. Others simply could not. A damaged village required enormous quantities of timber, stone, food, and labor. If surrounding farmland had also been destroyed, rebuilding became even less practical. Families quietly relocated instead. Centuries later, archaeologists occasionally uncover entire neighborhoods preserved exactly where disaster interrupted daily routines. Cooking fires remained beside unfinished meals. Looms still held partially woven cloth. Storage jars contained grain harvested only weeks before destruction. These discoveries reveal something deeply human. The residents expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday. None imagined their ordinary afternoon would become part of the archaeological record. Earthquakes represented only one form of geological danger. Mountains themselves sometimes collapsed. Heavy rainfall saturated steep slopes until the soil could no longer support its own weight. Entire hillsides suddenly transformed into moving rivers of earth, stone, and broken trees. Villages built beneath these slopes possessed almost no chance of escape. Landslides moved astonishingly fast. People often heard them before seeing them. A deep roaring sound echoed through the valley. Some described it as continuous thunder. Others compared it to countless wagons crossing wooden bridges at once. Within moments, the mountainside arrived. Homes disappeared beneath mud several meters deep. Fields vanished. Streams changed direction. Roads ceased to exist. When survivors eventually returned, familiar landmarks had completely vanished beneath newly deposited earth. Finding the exact location of former houses became nearly impossible. Nature had redrawn the landscape itself. Floods produced similar confusion, although through different means. Rivers usually followed predictable channels that generations of villagers came to trust. Yet, exceptionally heavy rainfall, rapid snowmelt, or natural dams, breaking upstream occasionally transformed quiet rivers into destructive torrents. Water carried enormous power. Trees became battering rams. Large boulders rolled downstream. Bridges collapsed. Buildings closest to riverbanks disappeared first. The flood often lasted only hours. Its consequences endured for decades. One remarkable challenge following major floods involved fertile farmland. People often assume floods always improve agriculture by depositing rich sediment. Sometimes they did. Other times they buried fields beneath thick layers of gravel, sand, or stones, unsuitable for cultivation. The land remained. Its usefulness disappeared. Families who had depended upon those fields for generations suddenly possessed soil incapable of supporting future harvests. Rebuilding houses made little sense if food could no longer be grown nearby. Some villages, therefore, survived the disaster itself, but not its long-term economic consequences. Elsewhere, volcanic landscapes introduced another extraordinary hazard. Many volcanic regions remain fertile precisely because ancient eruptions enriched surrounding soil with minerals. Communities understandably settled there, enjoying productive harvests for generations. The volcano often appeared peaceful, sometimes for centuries. Children grew into grandparents without witnessing any unusual activity. The mountain simply became part of everyday scenery. Then subtle changes emerged. Small earthquakes, unusual smells carried by the wind, warm springs becoming hotter, animals behaving strangely. Most people lacked any reason to interpret these signs correctly. When eruptions finally began, events unfolded with terrifying speed. Ash darkened the sky. Breathing became difficult. Roofs collapsed beneath accumulating volcanic debris. Fields disappeared beneath thick gray layers. Streams filled with mud. Even villages untouched by flowing lava often became impossible to inhabit because agriculture had completely collapsed. Some communities escaped, others did not. The famous examples preserved beneath volcanic ash attract worldwide attention today. Yet, countless smaller settlements experienced similar fates without leaving written histories. Archaeologists continue discovering forgotten villages hidden beneath layers of volcanic material across many regions of the world. Each excavation reminds us how fragile ordinary life could be. Not every geological disaster announced itself dramatically. Along certain coastlines, the sea gradually advanced year after year. Storm surges repeatedly damaged homes nearest the shore. Saltwater slowly contaminated freshwater wells. Productive farmland became increasingly difficult to cultivate. Residents adapted repeatedly. They moved fences, raised buildings, constructed protective embankments. Eventually, however, adaptation became impossible. The sea claimed the remaining land. Villages relocated inland. Their former streets disappeared beneath waves. Centuries later, divers occasionally discover stone foundations resting quietly beneath coastal waters. Silent evidence that people once lived where fish now swim. To later generations, such places inspired remarkable legends. People imagined cursed settlements swallowed by angry seas, entire churches hidden beneath lakes, ghostly bells supposedly ringing underwater. Reality required no supernatural explanation. Nature itself possessed more than enough power. Yet even after surviving disease, changing weather, war, earthquakes, floods, landslides, and volcanic eruptions, some villages still faced another, quieter force, one that did not arrive in a single day, but slowly erased communities from history through changing trade routes, forgotten roads, and the gradual movement of opportunity itself. The greatest mystery surrounding many vanished villages is not why they disappeared. It is why nobody remembered them. One might assume that a place where dozens or even hundreds of people once lived would remain part of local memory forever. Parents would tell their children about it. Travelers would mention its location. Maps would preserve its name. Neighboring communities would continue visiting the abandoned church or old marketplace. Sometimes that happened. Remarkably often, it did not. Within only a few generations, memory itself could begin to fade. The final residents left. Their children established new homes elsewhere. Grandchildren grew up hearing only fragments of old stories. Soon, even those fragments disappeared. The landscape remained. The people who understood it were gone. Modern archaeologists regularly encounter this remarkable silence. They discover evidence of substantial settlements in places where no written record survives. Entire neighborhoods emerge beneath farmland. Ancient roads appear beneath forests. Cemeteries containing hundreds of carefully arranged burials lie hidden only a short distance from modern villages, whose residents had no idea their ancestors once lived there. The discoveries often begin almost accidentally. A farmer notices unusually shaped stones while plowing. Construction workers uncover old foundations. Heavy rain washes away soil, exposing pieces of pottery. Metal detector enthusiasts receive permission to search abandoned fields and recover ancient coins or tools. At first, each object seems ordinary. One broken pot, one rusted knife, one weathered coin. Individually, they reveal very little. Together, however, they begin telling an extraordinary story. Archaeology resembles assembling an enormous puzzle after most of the pieces have vanished. Every discovery raises additional questions. Why was this house built here? Where did its occupants obtain water? How many people lived together? What crops did they grow? Why was the settlement abandoned? Answers rarely come immediately. Instead, researchers patiently examine thousands of tiny clues. Soil provides some of the most valuable evidence. To casual observers, dirt simply appears brown. To archaeologists, every layer represents another chapter of history. Dark soil may indicate centuries of cooking fires. Ash layers suggest repeated burning. Animal bones reveal dietary habits. Seeds preserved by unusual conditions identify crops once cultivated. Even microscopic grains of pollen carried by the wind centuries ago can reconstruct forgotten landscapes. Imagine standing in an empty meadow today. Nothing interrupts the grass except gentle hills. Birds sing, wildflowers bloom. The place feels untouched. Beneath your feet, however, rests an entire forgotten community. Children once played exactly where butterflies now drift. Families gathered around evening fires. Dogs barked at strangers, approaching along roads no longer visible. Every ordinary moment left subtle traces. The earth quietly preserved them. One fascinating technique involves studying post holes. Many historical houses were built using large wooden posts anchored deep into the ground. The timber eventually rotted away. The holes remained, filled naturally with darker soil than the surrounding earth. These circular marks become visible during excavation. To most people, they resemble simple stains. To archaeologists, they reveal complete building plans, room sizes, door locations, roof supports. Sometimes entire streets emerge from nothing more than patterns of dark circles beneath the surface. No walls survive, yet the village slowly reappears. Ancient rubbish proves equally valuable. Historical communities produced waste just as modern societies do, although of a very different kind. Broken pottery, animal bones from meals, damaged tools beyond repair. ash from cooking fires, discarded leather shoes, instead of organized landfills. Many villages deposited these materials in nearby pits. Centuries later, these forgotten rubbish heaps become historical treasure. They reveal what people ate, how wealthy they were, whether they traded with distant regions. Even changing fashions occasionally appear through fragments of clothing accessories or jewelry. One person's discarded object becomes another generation's priceless evidence. Sometimes archaeologists uncover remarkably personal items: a child's wooden toy, a bone comb missing several teeth, a sewing needle dropped between floorboards, a simple ring lost beneath a doorway. These discoveries transform anonymous history into something deeply human. Someone carved that toy. Someone searched unsuccessfully for the missing ring. Someone intended to repair clothing using that needle. Ordinary lives become visible once again. Burial grounds provide another important source of knowledge. Historical cemeteries reveal average life expectancy, childhood mortality, nutrition, injuries, and diseases affecting entire populations. Scientists examine skeletons with extraordinary care. Healed broken bones suggest successful recovery after accidents. Worn joints indicate years of physical labor. Dental patterns reveal surprisingly detailed information about diet. Even chemical analysis of teeth sometimes identifies where individuals spent childhood, because local water leaves distinctive mineral signatures within developing enamel. In this way, silent bones occasionally describe journeys forgotten for centuries. Technology has transformed these investigations dramatically. Researchers no longer depend solely upon excavation. Aircraft equipped with laser scanning, known today as LiDAR, can detect subtle ground features hidden beneath dense forests. From the ground, nothing appears unusual. From above, ancient roads, defensive ditches, terraces, and house foundations suddenly become visible. Entire landscapes emerge without turning a single shovel. Satellite imagery reveals crop marks invisible during ordinary walks. Plants growing above buried stone often develop differently from those rooted in deeper soil. During dry summers, these slight differences become visible from the sky. Hidden buildings quietly announce their presence through changing shades of green and gold. Ground-penetrating radar offers another remarkable window into the past. Instead of digging immediately, researchers send harmless radio waves into the earth. Those waves bounce back differently depending upon what lies below. Walls, graves, roads, foundations, each produces a distinctive pattern. Archaeologists create detailed underground maps before excavation even begins. What once required years of uncertain digging now starts with surprisingly accurate images of invisible landscapes. Yet despite all this sophisticated technology, some discoveries still occur exactly as they did centuries ago. By accident, a child exploring the woods notices unusually straight embankments. A tree falls during a storm, exposing ancient stonework beneath its roots. A drought lowers lake levels, revealing forgotten building foundations submerged long ago. History patiently waits beneath familiar places. Occasionally, nature decides to reveal a small portion. Not every excavation answers every question. Many deepen the mystery instead. Researchers sometimes identify an entire village, but never discover exactly why it disappeared. Evidence suggests several possibilities: climate, disease, economic decline, conflict, perhaps all of them together. History rarely offers simple explanations. Real lives seldom followed single causes. The most successful archaeological investigations, therefore, combine many different fields. Historians examine written records. Geologists study soil and rock. Climate scientists analyze ancient pollen and tree rings. Biologists investigate animal remains. Chemists examine preserved materials. Each discipline contributes another small piece of the larger puzzle. Together, they reconstruct communities erased from memory for hundreds or even thousands of years. Perhaps the most humbling lesson is this: the overwhelming majority of people who have ever lived left no famous monuments, no books, no statues, no portraits. They raised families, worked fields, repaired roofs, celebrated weddings, mourned funerals, shared meals, laughed with neighbors. Then, slowly or suddenly, their villages disappeared. For centuries, it seemed as though they had vanished completely. Yet beneath layers of earth, their everyday lives endured in quiet fragments, patiently waiting for someone curious enough to ask a simple question: who lived here? The answers continue to surprise historians every year, because with each newly discovered settlement, we are reminded that history is not merely the story of emperors and kingdoms. It is also the story of countless ordinary villages that appeared, flourished, disappeared, and then, centuries later, found their voices once again through the silent language of the ground itself. Even after archaeologists identify a forgotten village, another difficult challenge immediately appears. How can anyone reconstruct the daily lives of people who never wrote diaries, left no detailed records, and whose names disappeared centuries ago? The answer lies not in one dramatic discovery, but in thousands of ordinary details. A cooking pot, a worn doorstep, animal footprints preserved in dried mud, charred grains resting inside an abandoned storage pit. Each object appears insignificant alone. Together, they allow historians to rebuild entire worlds. Imagine entering one of these vanished villages on an ordinary summer morning. There is no disaster, no panic. Nothing suggests that future generations will one day search for traces of this place beneath layers of soil. Smoke rises gently from several chimneys. A rooster announces the beginning of another day. Someone opens a wooden shutter overlooking the central path. Nearby, an elderly woman sweeps dust away from the entrance to her cottage. With the same slow movements she has repeated for decades. The village feels permanent. The people believe tomorrow will resemble today. Most historical villages awakened before sunrise because daylight represented the most valuable resource available. Candles remained expensive. Oil lamps produced limited light. Work naturally followed the movement of the sun. Long before dawn painted the eastern sky, fires were already being rekindled from glowing embers, carefully preserved overnight. Starting an entirely new fire every morning required time and effort. Keeping one alive through the night proved much easier. Archaeologists frequently discover the remains of these household hearths. Ash, charcoal, burned stones, fragments of cooking vessels, blackened by years of use. Each layer represents hundreds, or even thousands, of ordinary meals. Breakfast varied enormously depending upon region and social status. Many families began the day with coarse bread baked several days earlier. Others prepared porridge using oats, barley, millet, or rye. Goat's milk, cheese, onions, beans, dried fruit, or simple vegetable stews often completed the meal. Fresh meat appeared much less frequently than modern imagination sometimes suggests. Animals represented wealth. Keeping them alive usually made better economic sense than eating them immediately. Children learned practical responsibilities remarkably early. A 7-year-old might already carry water from the village well. Another gathered firewood from nearby woodland. Older brothers repaired fences. Older sisters helped prepare food or watched younger siblings. Childhood certainly included games and laughter. It also involved meaningful work. Every pair of hands mattered. Excavations occasionally uncover tiny footprints preserved beside adult ones in ancient mud. These small impressions remind researchers that children participated in nearly every aspect of village life. Their stories deserve equal attention. Outside the houses, fields demanded constant care. Agriculture required extraordinary patience because rewards appeared months after the labor itself. Seeds planted during spring represented faith in an uncertain future. No farmer knew whether drought, insects, storms, or disease might destroy the coming harvest. Nevertheless, every season began with hope. Simple wooden plows scratched narrow furrows across the soil. Oxen pulled steadily through heavy earth. Farmers paused occasionally to wipe sweat from their faces before continuing until sunset. Their work shaped landscapes that remained recognizable for centuries. Many villages practiced communal farming in one form or another. Neighbors frequently assisted one another during especially demanding periods. Harvesting grain before rain arrived often required everyone working together. A widow whose husband had died might receive help from surrounding families. An injured farmer could rely upon relatives and friends until recovery. Cooperation was not merely kindness, it represented survival. Communities, divided by constant disagreement, rarely endured difficult years successfully. The village blacksmith occupied a particularly important position. His workshop echoed throughout the day with the familiar rhythm of hammer striking iron. He repaired plowshares worn dull by rocky fields, sharpened axes, forged nails, created horseshoes, fixed broken hinges. Without his skills, agriculture itself became more difficult. Interestingly, archaeologists often identify blacksmith workshops through surprisingly small clues: tiny flakes of iron, charcoal, pieces of furnace lining, hammer scale scattered across the ground. The building itself may have vanished long ago. Its work remains visible. Nearby, the village mill transformed harvested grain into flour, whether powered by water or wind. The mill represented one of the most important structures in many communities. Long lines sometimes formed during harvest season as families waited patiently for their turn. The sound of turning millstones became part of everyday life. If the mill stopped because drought reduced river flow or mechanical parts failed, the entire settlement immediately noticed. Bread production slowed. Travel increased as people searched for functioning mills elsewhere. A seemingly simple machine influenced hundreds of daily decisions. Animals wandered almost everywhere. Chickens scratched between houses, searching for insects. Geese announced unfamiliar visitors with remarkable enthusiasm. Pigs rooted beneath hedges. Cats quietly controlled mice threatening precious grain stores. Dogs accompanied shepherds into surrounding fields. The village did not separate human and animal life as clearly as modern towns often do. Their worlds constantly overlapped. The seasons governed every activity. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded endless maintenance. Autumn required urgent harvesting. Winter shifted attention toward repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and preserving food. No season remained idle. Each introduced different responsibilities. Even during colder months, work continued indoors beside warm hearths. Women and men alike contributed specialized skills. Spinning thread occupied countless winter evenings. Weaving transformed wool into clothing. Leather workers repaired worn shoes. Basket makers replaced broken containers. Every household produced as much as possible, because purchasing manufactured goods remained difficult and expensive. Little was wasted. Broken pottery occasionally served new purposes. Old clothing became patches. Worn wooden tools found second lives as firewood. Resourcefulness shaped ordinary existence. Visitors brought excitement. A traveling merchant displayed objects rarely seen within the village. Bright cloth from distant regions, unusual spices, metal goods, glass beads. Children gathered curiously, while adults discussed prices. Sometimes entertainers accompanied caravans. Musicians, storytellers, acrobats. Their arrival interrupted familiar routines with welcome novelty. News traveled alongside commerce. Political events, harvest conditions elsewhere, rumors of distant wars, religious festivals, royal marriages. Everything spread through conversation. Long before newspapers existed, information flowed continuously along human networks. Evening gradually transformed the atmosphere. Livestock returned from grazing. Cooking fires filled the air with comforting smells. Families gathered together after long hours of labor. Stories passed from older generations to younger listeners. Songs echoed softly between cottages. Simple games entertained children before sleep. The village settled into darkness, beneath stars unchallenged by electric lights. To modern observers, such evenings may appear peaceful. Often they truly were. Yet beneath that quiet routine existed constant uncertainty. Would tomorrow's weather favor the crops? Would livestock remain healthy? Would taxes increase? Would another harsh winter arrive? Would children survive to adulthood? Ordinary life always balanced hope against unpredictability. Perhaps that is why archaeologists find these villages so compelling. The discoveries are rarely spectacular treasures. More often, they reveal evidence of everyday existence. A spoon worn smooth by decades of use. A cracked bowl carefully repaired rather than discarded. A doorstep polished by countless footsteps. These humble objects remind us that history belonged not only to rulers and conquerors, it belonged equally to ordinary families whose greatest ambition was often remarkably simple: to plant in spring, harvest in autumn, raise children safely, and remain together. For many villages, those hopes became reality for generations. For others, circumstances changed beyond anyone's control. The familiar rhythm of ordinary life slowly weakened. One difficult year followed another. Then came the moment when someone, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps with quiet determination, loaded a wagon for what would become the final journey away from the only home their family had ever known. The decision to leave was almost never made in a single evening. It developed gradually. A conversation after harvest, a worried glance toward nearly empty grain stores, a letter carried by a traveling merchant, news that relatives in another valley had found more fertile land. Each small moment added another reason to consider what once seemed impossible. Leaving home, modern people often relocate several times during their lives. New jobs, education, or changing circumstances make moving relatively common. Historical villagers experienced something very different. Many expected to spend their entire lives within only a few miles of the place where they were born. The fields were familiar. The forests carried childhood memories. Every path had a story. Every large oak marked the boundary of someone's land. Even the hills possessed names, understood only by local residents. Leaving meant abandoning more than a house. It meant leaving behind an entire landscape of memory. Imagine a farming family sometime during the late Middle Ages. The father sits quietly beside the evening fire after another disappointing harvest. His hands bear the marks of decades spent working the soil. Across the room, his wife carefully counts sacks of grain stored for winter. She counts them twice, then a third time. The total never changes. There simply is not enough. Neither speaks for several minutes. The silence itself carries meaning. Finally, someone says what both have already begun to understand. Perhaps it is time to leave. The suggestion hangs in the air. No one answers immediately. Their parents lived here. Their grandparents are buried in the small churchyard nearby. The children have never known another home. How does a family decide to abandon generations of history? Usually, very slowly, the following weeks become filled with careful discussions. Which possessions deserve space on the wagon? Which animals can survive the journey? Who might buy the remaining tools? Should they travel before winter or wait until spring? Every answer creates another difficult question. Nothing about departure feels simple. Historical inventories occasionally reveal just how few belongings many families actually owned. Several wooden chests, iron cooking pots, simple furniture built by local craftsmen, handmade blankets, farming tools, seeds carefully saved for future planting, religious objects carrying deep personal meaning. Each item represented years of labor. Choosing what to carry often meant deciding what part of one's life would remain behind forever. Neighbors noticed the preparations. Some offered encouragement. Others expressed disbelief. Surely next year's harvest would improve. Surely conditions would return to normal. Perhaps they would. Perhaps they would not. No one possessed certainty. That uncertainty made every decision heavier. Children often viewed the situation differently from adults. Some felt excitement at the thought of seeing new places. Others feared leaving familiar friends behind. A young boy might ask whether the new village would have a river like the old one. His sister wonders if apple trees grow there too. Parents answer as honestly as they can. Sometimes they simply do not know. Departure day usually arrived before sunrise. Travel during daylight proved safer and more efficient. Oxen or horses pulled heavily loaded wagons along muddy roads shaped by generations of previous travelers. Neighbors gathered quietly. Some embraced. Others exchanged promises to visit someday. Many genuinely believed those promises. Distance, however, often prevented reunions. A final glance toward the cottage. Smoke no longer rises from its chimney. The wooden door closes. Perhaps for the last time, the wagon begins moving. The village slowly disappears behind trees. No dramatic music accompanies the moment, only the ordinary sounds of wheels turning over uneven ground. For those remaining behind, another empty house immediately changes the appearance of the settlement. Windows remain dark after sunset. The garden gradually fills with weeds. A fence damaged by winter storms remains unrepaired. The absence becomes visible. One family leaving rarely destroyed a village. Several departures within a few years created a different picture. The blacksmith now serves fewer customers. The mill processes less grain. Community gatherings become noticeably smaller. Voices once familiar every evening are no longer heard. Those who remain work harder because fewer hands share the same responsibilities. Fields once cultivated together now require difficult choices. Which land should continue producing crops? Which plots must unfortunately be abandoned? Nature answers quickly. Grass grows across neglected furrows. Wildflowers appear where wheat once ripened. Young birch trees establish themselves beside unused paths. The transformation begins almost immediately. Within 5 years, visitors already notice changes. Within 20, the village feels strangely quiet. Within 50, newcomers may struggle to imagine how busy it once appeared. Occasionally, a few determined families refused to leave despite overwhelming difficulties. Their resilience deserves admiration. They repaired collapsing roofs, using salvaged timber, shared remaining livestock, combined scattered fields into manageable farms. Some succeeded remarkably well. Their villages survived hardships that historians once believed impossible. Others eventually reached the same conclusion as those who had departed earlier. Persistence alone could not always overcome changing circumstances. One especially poignant archaeological discovery appears in abandoned churches. Religious buildings often remained standing longer than surrounding homes because they were constructed more carefully. As cottages disappeared, villagers sometimes continued returning for occasional worship or to visit family graves. The church became the final link, connecting former residents with their abandoned home. Eventually, even those visits stopped. Grass covered the pathways leading to the entrance. Birds nested beneath damaged roofs. Rain slowly entered through broken windows. Silence settled over the place. Centuries later, only weathered stone walls remained to suggest that an entire community had once gathered there every week. Written records occasionally preserve the final mentions of forgotten villages. A tax document lists 20 households. Several decades later, only 8. Another generation passes. The next record mentions merely 2 occupied farms. Finally, a clerk writes a brief note. Deserted. Just one word. No explanation. No description of the families. No account of their journey. Only a quiet acknowledgement that the village no longer existed. History often compresses human experience into astonishingly short entries. Behind that single word lay countless individual decisions. Parents protecting children, grandparents saying farewell to familiar landscapes, young couples searching for better opportunities. Every abandoned settlement contained hundreds of deeply personal stories, never recorded by chroniclers. Even after departure, former residents frequently carried memories throughout their lives. A particular smell might remind them of home. The sound of church bells in another village recalled the ones they left behind. Certain recipes preserved family traditions connected to places that no longer existed. Memory became the final village. It traveled wherever the people went. Sometimes descendants returned decades later, hopping to show children where earlier generations had lived. They discovered only scattered stones, hidden beneath tall grass. The orchard remained. No houses stood nearby. The well still existed, although half filled with leaves. Standing there, they attempted to imagine voices that had long since faded into history. Perhaps they succeeded for a moment. Then they turned away. Time continued its patient work. The abandoned settlement slowly blended into the surrounding landscape, until even careful observers struggled to distinguish human history from nature itself. This quiet disappearance occurred thousands upon thousands of times across the world, not through spectacular catastrophe, not through legendary curses, but through ordinary people making extraordinarily difficult choices. Their names disappeared, their homes collapsed, yet the landscapes they shaped continued influencing future generations in subtle ways. Ancient field boundaries became modern property lines. Old village roads evolved into country lanes. Forgotten wells occasionally supplied water centuries after the houses surrounding them had vanished. History never truly disappeared. It simply changed form. And perhaps that is the most remarkable lesson these vanished villages leave behind. Even when a community seems completely lost, careful eyes can still find faint traces of the lives once lived there, waiting quietly beneath the grass, beside forgotten paths, and under the patient weight of passing centuries. Long after the final family departed, the abandoned village entered a new chapter of its existence. Ironically, this was the longest chapter of all. People often imagine that once a settlement is deserted, nothing more happens there. In reality, the landscape continues changing every single day. The absence of people does not create stillness. It simply allows nature to become the primary architect. The process begins almost immediately. Without footsteps, narrow paths soften after the first heavy rain. Grass pushes through compacted soil, Seeds carried by the wind settle into forgotten gardens. Tiny insects establish nests beneath loose stones. Life quietly reorganizes itself. The transformation is so gradual that nobody notices it from one day to the next. Yet, after several decades, the difference becomes astonishing. The first buildings to disappear are usually those with thatched roofs. Straw and reeds require constant maintenance. Even occupied houses demanded regular replacement of damaged sections. Once abandoned, rain slowly penetrates the roof. Wooden beams absorb moisture. During winter, freezing temperatures expand tiny cracks. Spring warmth weakens the timber further. One particularly heavy snowfall or autumn storm finally proves too much. The roof surrenders. Its collapse marks the beginning of the house's final decline. Sunlight now reaches the interior directly. Rain falls onto the earthen floor. Seeds carried by birds begin sprouting inside what was once the family living space. Within only a few years, young saplings emerge where children once slept. Nature shows remarkable patience. It never rushes. It simply continues. Stone buildings appear stronger. Indeed, many survive for centuries. Yet they too depend upon constant attention. Mortar binding the stones gradually washes away. Small plants establish roots inside tiny cracks. Every growing season, those roots become slightly thicker. Eventually, they force individual stones apart. The wall remains standing, but it is no longer solid. A particularly strong wind or minor earthquake completes the work that years of patient growth had already begun. The wall collapses, one stone at a time. Wooden fences vanish even more quickly. Untreated timber returns to the soil surprisingly fast. After only a few decades, archaeologists often discover nothing except faint discolorations marking where fence posts once stood. To casual visitors, there seems to have been no boundary at all. Yet careful excavation reveals an entire network of property lines that once organized village life. Gardens undergo fascinating transformations. Cultivated vegetables disappear first because they depend upon constant human care. Wild grasses replace carefully maintained rows. Berry bushes survive much longer. Fruit trees continue producing harvests despite having no one to gather them. For many years, apples simply fall onto the ground each autumn. Birds feast upon them. Animals carry seeds into surrounding woodland. The orchard slowly expands beyond its original boundaries. Centuries later, historians occasionally identify forgotten villages simply because unusually old fruit trees still grow where no orchard should logically exist. A single apple tree may become the last living witness to an entire community. Animals notice abandoned villages long before humans forget them. Mice occupy empty storage buildings, searching for scattered grain. Foxes discover excellent shelter beneath collapsed roofs. Owls nest inside abandoned towers. Badgers excavate tunnels beneath old foundations. Eventually, deer wander freely through streets once crowded with carts and livestock. The balance between human space and wild space gradually shifts, not through conflict, through absence. Forests prove especially efficient at reclaiming abandoned settlements. Young pioneer species appear first. Birch, willow, aspen, these fast-growing trees tolerate open sunlight remarkably well. Their roots stabilize disturbed ground. As decades pass, slower-growing oaks, beeches, or pines gradually replace them. The woodland matures. After 2 or 3 centuries, an experienced traveler may stand within a beautiful forest, completely unaware that hundreds of people once lived there. Only subtle clues remain. An unnaturally flat area, a shallow depression marking an ancient cellar, fragments of brick emerging after heavy rain. Nothing more. Water quietly reshapes abandoned landscapes as well. Drainage ditches built by generations of careful labor slowly become blocked by leaves and sediment. Without maintenance, they cease functioning. Seasonal floods create new channels. Small ponds develop where gardens once flourished. Marsh plants colonize permanently damp ground. Even rivers occasionally erase evidence of nearby settlements by gradually changing course over many decades. The village disappears not because anyone destroyed it, because the landscape itself never stops evolving. Local legends often begin during this stage. Imagine several generations passing after abandonment. Children hear adults mention an old village somewhere beyond the hills. Nobody remembers exactly where. Someone claims hidden treasure remains buried beneath the ruins. Another insists mysterious lights appear there at night. A shepherd reports hearing strange sounds carried by the wind. Ordinary natural events slowly acquire supernatural explanations because the original history has faded from memory. Many famous ghost stories likely began this way. An abandoned chimney whistles during strong winds. Moonlight reflects from pale stones hidden among trees. Owls call from empty buildings. Travelers unfamiliar with the place allow imagination to complete the story. Reality needs no ghosts. Time itself creates mysteries. Even names disappear. Historical place names often survive surprisingly long. A nearby stream might still carry the abandoned village's name. An open meadow preserves the memory in local speech. Eventually, pronunciation changes. Words become shorter. Their original meaning fades. Centuries later, residents continue using an ancient name without realizing it refers to a settlement forgotten long ago. Language quietly preserves history in unexpected ways. Agricultural fields sometimes protect archaeological remains remarkably well. Farmers continue cultivating land long after houses disappear. Plowing gradually mixes upper layers of soil. Pottery fragments reach the surface. Ancient nails emerge beside freshly planted crops. Generations of farmers notice unusual objects, but rarely imagine the complete story hidden below. To them, these are simply old things occasionally found while working. Only modern archaeology recognizes their greater significance. Not every abandoned village remains untouched. Later generations occasionally reuse building materials. Stone from old walls becomes foundations for newer houses. Timber, if still sound, finds another purpose. Even roof tiles may be collected and transported elsewhere. This recycling complicates archaeological investigation. Researchers must distinguish between what belonged to the original village and what later visitors removed or rearranged. History rarely remains neatly preserved. It evolves continuously. Weather contributes countless subtle changes. Wind carries fine dust that slowly buries exposed foundations. Leaves accumulate every autumn. They decay into rich soil. Year after year, the ground level rises almost imperceptibly. After several centuries, entire buildings may lie hidden beneath only a meter of earth. Nothing dramatic occurs, only endless repetition. Autumn follows summer. Winter follows autumn. Spring follows winter. Again and again. Eventually, the village seems to have melted into the landscape. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this process is how completely ordinary it is. No conspiracy, no curse, no mysterious disappearance beyond explanation. Simply thousands of quiet days adding together. One rainy afternoon, one windy night, one autumn leaf, one fallen branch, one growing root. Given enough time, those ordinary moments accomplish extraordinary transformations. Historians sometimes describe abandoned villages as frozen moments in time. In one sense, that is true. The archaeological remains preserve evidence of past lives. Yet above ground, nothing remains frozen. Nature continues writing new chapters long after human ones have ended. Centuries later, another generation arrives, not to live, not to farm, but to ask questions. They carry notebooks instead of plows, measuring tapes instead of seed, brushes instead of shovels. They are archaeologists, standing where ordinary families once stood. They begin carefully uncovering the quiet traces left beneath the soil. And little by little, a village that vanished from memory begins to exist once more, not as a living community, but as a story patiently waiting to be told. The first day of an archaeological excavation is usually far quieter than popular films suggest. There is no dramatic discovery waiting just beneath the surface. No gleaming treasure chest appears after the first shovel of earth. Instead, the work begins with patience, careful measurements, detailed maps, long conversations. Every movement is planned because once soil has been removed, it can never be replaced exactly as it was before. Archaeologists often say they are not digging for objects, they are digging for information. That distinction matters enormously. A broken pottery fragment by itself tells only a small story. The exact place where it was found, the depth beneath the surface, its relationship to nearby objects, those details transform an ordinary piece of clay into valuable historical evidence. Imagine standing beside a forgotten village shortly before excavation begins. From a distance, the landscape appears entirely ordinary. Gentle hills, wild grass moving quietly in the breeze, perhaps a few scattered trees. Nothing immediately suggests that dozens of homes once occupied this peaceful meadow. The village seems gone, yet experienced archaeologists begin noticing subtle irregularities almost immediately. A slight rectangular rise in the ground, an unusually straight embankment, a depression that remains damp even during dry weather, small fragments of pottery exposed by recent rain. Each clue appears insignificant. Together, they outline a settlement invisible to everyone else. Before any digging begins, researchers spend weeks documenting everything they can see. Modern surveying equipment measures the landscape with astonishing precision. Old maps are compared with modern satellite images. Historical documents, if they exist at all, are examined carefully. Even local residents often contribute valuable information. An elderly farmer may remember that his grandfather always avoided plowing one particular corner of a field because stones repeatedly damaged the plow. A shepherd recalls finding unusual pieces of brick during childhood. A hunter mentions an old well hidden beneath thick bushes. These memories sometimes provide the first practical guidance. Excavation itself proceeds slowly, very slowly. Large machines are used only when absolutely necessary to remove modern topsoil. Once archaeologists approach ancient layers, almost everything happens by hand. Trowels replace shovels. Small brushes replace large tools. Buckets carry away loose earth. Progress is measured not in meters, but in centimeters. Some days produce remarkable discoveries. Other days reveal almost nothing. Both outcomes matter equally. Every empty space also tells part of the story. Color differences in the soil become surprisingly important. To an untrained eye, earth often appears uniformly brown. An archaeologist sees subtle variations. A darker patch may indicate an ancient storage pit. A circular stain suggests where a wooden post once stood. A narrow line of compacted gravel marks an old pathway walked by generations of villagers. The people disappeared centuries ago. Their footsteps remain. One of the most emotional moments during many excavations occurs when the layout of the first house finally becomes visible, not through standing walls. Those usually vanished long ago, Instead, archaeologists recognize patterns: post holes outlining rectangular buildings, stone foundations hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soil, the location of a hearth, a doorway facing the morning sun. Suddenly, abstract history becomes a real home. Someone once prepared meals here. Someone repaired clothing beside that fire. Children slept within these walls. The house no longer exists. Its memory begins returning. Excavations frequently reveal that villages changed continuously during their lifetimes. Homes expanded. Older buildings were replaced. Roads shifted slightly. New wells were dug when older ones failed. The settlement never remained perfectly still. People adapted just as modern communities do. This constant evolution challenges another common misconception. Historical villages were not frozen in time until abandonment. They were living places, always changing, always adjusting. Fire sometimes becomes archaeology's greatest ally. Although devastating for the original inhabitants, accidental fires occasionally preserve remarkable evidence. When buildings burn and collapse rapidly, everyday objects remain buried exactly where they were being used. Clay hardens, seeds become carbonized instead of decomposing. Wooden structures leave clear impressions. The tragedy experienced centuries ago unexpectedly protects countless details for future researchers. Carbonized grain deserves special attention. To most people, a burned seed appears worthless. To scientists, it can answer extraordinary questions. Which crops were cultivated? Were harvests successful? Did villagers experiment with new varieties? Was grain imported from distant regions? Microscopic analysis reveals astonishing information hidden inside something no larger than a fingernail. Animal bones tell equally fascinating stories. Archaeologists identify whether villagers raised cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, or chickens. Cut marks reveal butchering techniques. Bone chemistry provides clues about animal diets. Age profiles indicate whether livestock were valued primarily for meat, milk, wool, or labor. Entire agricultural systems emerge from careful examination of discarded bones. One particularly moving category of discoveries involves personal belongings. A bronze brooch dropped beside a doorway, glass beads scattered across a floor, an iron key resting where someone placed it centuries earlier. These objects rarely possess enormous monetary value. Their historical value is immeasurable. Each belonged to a real person. Someone fastened clothing using that brooch. Someone carried that key every day. Someone carefully selected those beads because they considered them beautiful. History briefly becomes intimate. Sometimes excavations uncover signs of childhood. Tiny leather shoes, simple whistles carved from bone, small clay figures, marbles shaped from stone. These discoveries remind everyone that villages contained laughter alongside labor. children explored the same streets, now hidden beneath grass. They invented games, collected interesting stones, asked endless questions. Their voices disappeared long ago. Their toys remained. Written records occasionally confirm archaeological discoveries. A forgotten tax register lists 24 households. Excavation identifies approximately 24 house plots. An old monastery account mentions a watermill. Researchers uncover its stone foundations beside the stream. For historians, such moments are deeply satisfying. Independent sources, separated by centuries, quietly agree with one another. Yet written records often remain incomplete. Many villages left no documents whatsoever. Archaeology becomes their only surviving voice. Weather constantly challenges excavation teams. Heavy rain fills trenches overnight. Strong sunlight dries delicate soils too quickly. Unexpected winds scatter recording papers. Every season introduces different difficulties. Researchers learn patience because history refuses to follow convenient schedules. Perhaps the most important principle governing archaeological work is restraint. Not every site should be completely excavated. This surprises many visitors. Surely uncovering everything would produce more knowledge. Paradoxically, the opposite may be true. Future generations will possess better technology, more advanced scientific methods, questions nobody has yet imagined. Leaving portions of a site untouched preserves opportunities for researchers decades, or even centuries from now. Archaeology, therefore, is also an act of trust, a gift offered to the future. Once fieldwork concludes, another chapter begins. Thousands of photographs require analysis. Drawings become digital maps. Pottery fragments are washed, sorted, and carefully reconstructed whenever possible. Seeds travel to laboratories. Animal bones receive specialist examination. Radiocarbon dating establishes timelines. The excavation may have lasted only several months. The research continues for many years. Eventually, scholars publish their findings. The forgotten village enters history once again, not as rumor, not as legend, but as evidence, carefully documented, patiently interpreted, respectfully remembered. Visitors may someday walk through a museum, displaying simple objects recovered from the site. A cracked bowl, an iron knife, a wooden spoon, preserved by unusual conditions. To some, they appear ordinary. To others, they represent something extraordinary, proof that generations of ordinary people lived meaningful lives in a place the world had almost completely forgotten. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of archaeology. It cannot bring the villagers back. It cannot rebuild their homes exactly as they stood, but it can rescue their existence from silence. It can remind us that beneath familiar fields and peaceful forests lie countless untold stories, still waiting to be uncovered, stories that continue to reshape our understanding of how entire villages disappeared without warning, and how, against all odds, they were finally found again. The discoveries made by archaeologists rarely provide a perfect ending. Instead, they offer something far more meaningful: understanding. Every forgotten village uncovered beneath forests, fields, deserts, or quiet meadows reminds us that history is far larger than the stories preserved in royal palaces or written chronicles. The overwhelming majority of people who have ever lived never ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, or left behind famous monuments. They woke before sunrise, cared for children, repaired roofs after storms, harvested grain before autumn rain, worried about difficult winters, and hoped the next year would be a little kinder than the last. For centuries, these ordinary lives remained almost invisible, not because they lacked importance, because history is often written by those with the ability to write. The farmer who carefully planted wheat, the shepherd who watched sheep along distant hills, the potter who shaped hundreds of simple cooking bowls, the miller who greeted neighbors every morning. Most never recorded their own stories, yet together they built civilizations. When archaeologists uncover a forgotten settlement, they are not simply discovering old buildings. They are recovering the lives of people who quietly shaped the world around them. One abandoned village might reveal how families adapted to colder weather. Another demonstrates the remarkable organization required to cultivate difficult landscapes. A third shows how trade connected distant regions long before modern transportation. Each excavation contributes another small piece to an enormous human story. Perhaps the most striking lesson is that villages almost never disappeared because of a single event. History rarely works that way. A poor harvest weakened food supplies. Malnutrition reduced resistance to illness. Disease removed valuable workers. Trade declined after roads shifted elsewhere. A harsh winter followed. Young families sought opportunities beyond the valley. The remaining population aged. Buildings deteriorated. Eventually, someone closed the final door. Looking backward, the disappearance seems inevitable. Living through it, however, every decision would have felt uncertain. People did not know they were witnessing the final years of their community. They believed next season might improve, next harvest might succeed, next spring might bring better weather. Hope remained remarkably resilient, even during difficult times. Modern researchers often emphasize resilience as much as hardship. Historical communities displayed extraordinary determination. They experimented with new farming methods, shared resources during shortages, rebuilt after floods and fires, adapted to changing climates, moved entire settlements when necessary. Human history is not merely a record of disasters. It is equally a record of persistence. Thousands of villages survived challenges that might easily have destroyed them. We remember the abandoned ones precisely because they were the exceptions, not the rule. Yet even those exceptions teach valuable lessons. They remind us that every society depends upon delicate connections, healthy soil, reliable water, cooperation between neighbors, trade, stability, trust, when enough of those connections weaken simultaneously. Even long-established communities may gradually fade away. Those lessons remain surprisingly relevant today. Modern technology has transformed daily life beyond anything historical villagers could imagine. Electricity, medicine, global communication, instant transportation. Yet communities still depend upon cooperation, environmental stability, and careful stewardship of natural resources. History never repeats itself exactly. It often echoes, standing among the ruins of a forgotten village, creates a curious feeling. There are no voices, no smoke rising from chimneys, no children running along narrow paths, only wind moving gently through grass, birds singing from trees, perhaps the distant sound of flowing water. At first, the place appears empty. Then, slowly, imagination begins filling the silence. A doorway once stood here. Someone baked bread beside that hearth. Neighbors paused along this road to exchange news after working in the fields. A dog barked from that corner. A child laughed somewhere beyond the well. Ordinary life briefly returns, not because ghosts remain, because evidence allows memory to exist once more. The abandoned village no longer feels forgotten. It feels remembered. Across every continent except Antarctica, archaeologists continue identifying settlements unknown only a few decades earlier. Dense forests conceal ancient communities. Deserts preserve remarkable ruins beneath drifting sand. Retreating glaciers expose long-hidden structures. Modern technology reveals entire landscapes invisible from ground level. The work continues because the Earth still holds countless unanswered questions. How many villages disappeared without leaving written records? How many remain undiscovered beneath modern cities? How many lie beneath lakes created centuries after their abandonment? Nobody knows. Each year produces new discoveries. Each discovery reminds us how much remains hidden. Perhaps somewhere beneath an ordinary field, a forgotten family home still waits. A child's toy remains beneath a collapsed floor. Seeds rest inside an ancient storage pit. Footprints survive where rain hardened soft clay 1,000 years ago. History possesses remarkable patience. It never hurries. It simply waits until someone asks the right question. In the end, the story of vanished villages is not really about disappearance. It is about change. Communities rise. They adapt. Sometimes they flourish for centuries. Sometimes circumstances overwhelm them. People move onward. Nature quietly reshapes the landscape. Memory fades. Then, generations later, curiosity begins the journey in reverse. A broken piece of pottery appears after heavy rain. An old map raises new questions. A careful excavation starts. Little by little, forgotten lives emerge from beneath the soil. The silence ends. The village speaks again, not through voices, not through legends, but through the quiet evidence left behind by ordinary people whose lives mattered just as much as those of kings and emperors. Their homes may have disappeared. Their names may have been forgotten, yet their story endures. Every stone, every path, every weathered foundation, every seed preserved beneath the earth reminds us that history is built not only by extraordinary moments, but by countless ordinary days lived by ordinary people. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. Even when time seems to erase everything, traces remain, patiently waiting, quietly enduring, ready to remind future generations that entire villages may disappear from the surface of the world, but they are never truly lost, for as long as someone is willing to remember them. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.